Hello, namaste, pranam, konnichiwa. I'm Zakir Hussain, and I'm an Indian traditional musician. I play this instrument, which is called tabla. It is two instruments played as one. And I feel honored, humbled, and blessed to be receiving the 2022 Kyoto Prize for Arts and Philosophy. This is the first time that the great Innamuri Foundation has chosen to give this award to someone from India. And so, from my country, India, and all the musicians and artists and creative people living in there, I'd like to also offer my deep gratitudes. It is, I guess, important for me to bring forth to you that which I represent, this tradition, this art form. In a nutshell, this art form is close to about 800 years old in this particular form. And it's important to remember when I say this particular form, it means that the art form in its most organic and core presence was already existing in India more than 2,000 years ago. But in the past 800 years, changes occurred and some sort of interaction took place between different cultures and different genres, and that allowed for the form to mutate and a new musical idea emerged. About 1,000 years ago, the form that we all used in India, which was performed all over in the palaces, in the temples, and for the people, was called Dhrupad. Dhrupad. This form, however, the one that I represent, was, you may call, a mix of two very prominent traditions of that time, 800 years ago. The temple Hindu tradition of India, which represented Dhrupad, Prabandh Gayaki, and the Sufi music of Islam that was called Kalbana and in present time known as Qawwali. These were fused together by one of the great Sufi sages of that time, Amir Khusro. And over the next 100 years or so, it was trying to find its feet, and when the idea solidified, a name was given to this particular musical form, and it was Khayal. Khayal means imagination. And one of the reasons why that was because in this art form, one of the important or salient feature is improvising, spontaneous thinking, being creative, using the elements that have been given to you, given the tools that have been provided. So that means right here on the stage, new ideas must emerge. And therefore, your imagination is something that plays an important role in the performance. So the name Khayal, which means imagination, was quite appropriate. So over the next few hundred years, the style developed, refined, and blossomed into being the premier form accepted in the North Indian classical music world. And many great masters came about, and as it happens, one master went from one part of northern India to another part of northern India, and his disciples went to other parts to spread the words. And so emerged, after assimilating information from these other regions that the maestros arrived, shades of this particular style. And so different schools were formed which integrated information, folk music, and that kind of thinking from the regions that they had come and settled in. So over the years developed 7 or 8 different schools. In tabla, which arrived much later, it's one of the youngest instruments, say maybe about 250 years ago, there are now 5 major schools that cover the length and breadth of northern and eastern India, from Punjab to Delhi to Ajrada to Farakabad to Lucknow to Banaras. It is, covering just about a swath of India which is close to, say, around 2,000 miles from one end to the other end. Now, the reason why I say this, northern India and eastern India, because below an imaginary line in India, there is a different style of traditional music known as Carnatic music, which uses different instruments, different way of projecting the music, performing the music, even though the repertoire that is used there is the same as the repertoire in North India. Now, being a country of almost 1 billion people, labor being very cheap, and no support from powers that be, whether it's administrations or palaces or whatever, it was difficult to be able to find good instruments and find instrument makers who could make them nicely. And when they did find them, it was almost impossible to actually gauge what was the amount that should be paid to them. So it turned out that the instrument makers were the one who suffered a lot, because labor being so cheap in India, they were being treated like house servants or a footman or something like that, and they were not being paid their due. And so many of them lived in poverty while still making some of the great instruments of those times, which were then played by or performed by the great maestros of that time. So that was one thing, that was an imbalance that occurred in the economic system of our classical music or our traditional music. In the past 100 years or so, that gradually started to change. And one of the reasons why the change occurred was in 1947, India gained its independence. And with that, the princely states which existed for the Maharajas or the Nawabs and kings in various little pockets of India, they were taken away by the government of India. And when that happened, the musicians who performed in those courts had to go and fend for themselves. And similarly, the infrastructure that went with that ripple effect, instrument makers, repairers, upkeep, and so on, they all had to go find another way to survive. And I have to say that some of the great masters of these times helped a lot. someone like my father, Ustad Alla Rakha, or Pandit Ravi Shankar, or Ustad Ali Akbar Khan, the great maestros, they focused on certain instrument makers, and monthly stipend were created for those instrument makers so that they didn't have to rely on waiting until somebody had to make an instrument. And they could survive, and they could experiment, and they could find new ways to be able to make the instrument better. And so that took place. And in doing that, the kind of performance that emerged got better and better in terms of tone and texture and sound quality. I studied with my father, Ustad Alla Rakha, who was considered one of the great legends of his time. He passed away in 2000, and but before that, he used to travel and tour with his colleague Pandit Ravi Shankar. They traveled all over the world. They also came to Japan. I have photos of my father in 1959 in Japan, in Tokyo, in Kyoto, and Nagasaki. It was a very, how should I say, intriguing time for me to be able to see those photos and see that there was this other tradition existing in another part of the world, which also represented an ancient core wisdom. So, studying with my father, I learned what I have now about this art form. So, coming to this instrument is tabla or doyra. This instrument is dagga or baya, but together they are known as a set of tabla. My right hand drum is a drum that's the high pitch one. The left hand drum is a low pitch one. The traditional way of setting up drums is that one side is low and one side is high. So that's what this is. Now, I have a tuning hammer that tunes the right hand drum, does not tune the left hand drum. So if I want to tune it lower, I would hit it from down up on these edges. But if I want to tune it back to higher, I will hit it from top down. So a short quarter note tuning up here. But if I had to tune a full note up or down, then I would use these pegs, which I will hit down to make the straps tighter so that I can tune it higher, or up to make the straps looser to tune it lower. That. This instrument, even though it's one surface, has different tones. Then. Now those are basic tones. Now within the tone like this, there are different shades. Or dead tones. So there's much available if you need to explore in terms of what the instrument has to offer. Left hand drum, the bass drum, is not tuned, but you can vary the pitches on this instrument by striking with the tip of the fingers and manipulating with the wrist. So, oh. So you can actually play tones and pitches, and you can play slide notes or expressively hard look, like, or high hail or rain falling. You can do many different things. Now, this is a muscular tradition, so it requires that fingers work in tandem with each other, and the phrases and the patterns that emerge are a combination of two hands. So there's a language that we first learn: na, ta, tun, tete, kat, ga, ghe sounds. And then we put them together and create syllables, and then words, and then phrases, and so on. So, dha, tete, tere kita, kat dha, gedin, kitita katiti kitita, dha titi kitita kata, tirikita kata, genta da, dadirikita kata, dadirikita kata, dadirikita kata. So you notice that it's a muscular tradition, so we don't have to whack the drum hard like a conga drum or a bongo drum or a djembe. It's a much more of a subtle touch interaction with the instrument, but yet you can get dynamically very soft or very hard tones, like so you can have much volume available or soft, and work with the dynamics like this. So you can play hard, you can play soft, you can play fast, you can play slow, you can utilize the resonance of the tone to create different wavy sounds and wobbly sounds and so on. So in that sense, this instrument, tabla, even though it's just two little drums, has a, I would say, unlimited range of sound available. And of course, in the recent time, tabla went from being just a traditional Indian instrument of accompaniment to also becoming a solo instrument. And now there is a repertoire that is being played by tabla players all over the world, where they actually go out and perform solo tabla performances for as long as 90 minutes or 2 hours. And one other little instrument called harmonium is used to accompany. That is a new development in tabla playing. Tabla players were at one time considered second-class citizens of the music world. So the main artist was the maestro, and the tabla player was basically an accompaniment. So that system was there, and the tabla player, obviously, even though it was a equal part of a performance, was not necessarily considered as someone who contributed in an important way to the performance. That changed since the late 1950s onwards, when three maestros, Pandit Kishan Maharaj, Pandit Shamta Prasad, and my father, Ustad Alla Rakha, formed relationship with three major instrumentalists of that time, Pandit Ravi Shankar, Ustad Vilayat Khan, and Ustad Ali Akbar Khan. And they developed a particular way of performing that focused and magnified and showcased the interaction of the two artists and their instruments, therefore bringing forth the importance of both. And because of that, the tabla players, because of these three giants, Alla Rakha, Shamta Prasad, and Kishan Maharaj, tabla gained status and visible importance in the concert presentations of India, and is now considered one of the main solo instruments of the North Indian tradition. Tabla became a very popular North Indian traditional instrument, but over the years, in the last 60 years, it has gained prominence as one of the main percussion instruments globally speaking. And so tabla is used in jazz, in rap, in hip-hop, in TV scores, film music scores, Western classical music, and so on and so forth. And so this has now become an instrument that is a rhythm instrument of choice when it comes to playing fusion music. So I would like to give just a little taste of how tabla has now influenced different percussion traditions all over the world, how the language of tabla that is spoken and performed is now being adapted by instruments that are non-Indian instruments, but technically, in terms of the way their instruments are played, are similar to tabla, are utilizing the repertoire that comes from North India and transposing them onto their instruments, and therefore those what you call borders and fences that are there for a lot of different kinds of people have basically melted down and dropped off when it comes to art and culture, and especially music. So I'm going to ask my friends, Mr. Abbos Kosimov, who's from Uzbekistan, who plays doyra, a frame drum, and Mr. Pezhham Akhavass, who's from Iran, who plays the tombak and another frame drum instrument called daf. So I would ask them to join me, and we will improvise, but we will base our improvisation in the repertoire that comes from my part of the world, from North India. And we will do compositions, traditional stuff that comes from that part of the world, which has been adapted by these great maestros, and I'm humbled and honored by their effort to do that. And it's just to give you an example of how the tradition of tabla has emerged forth into this world and cast its shadow on so many different rhythmic ideas. Thank you. This is the tombak, comes from Iran, and of course it has its own tradition of playing. Can you please? Bravo. Mr. Abbos Kosimov plays the doyra from Uzbekistan. And again, it's a hand drum, just like tabla and the tombak. But it's a technique which utilizes fingers, but he's got fingers where each one of his fingers is like 3 of mine. But now that's their way of playing. But when it comes to playing with this repertoire that I do, so if I speak a phrase and I play it myself, I'm sure they'll be able to individually replicate that in the way that they have adapted it. So if I went dha tere ki teta gadha, da treka de teta ka treka de teta dinga dinga, da ke teta ta ke teta ta ke teta ta ke teta. This is improvised, not rehearsed before, but because they have taken the trouble to figure out what North Indian rhythmic repertoire is like and have transposed it onto their instrument, and which is what I similarly have done with their repertoire. We are able to interconnect and create rhythmic music spontaneously. It is the thinking, I believe, in terms of art and culture and creativity and its ecosystem of the future. More and more artists all over the world are coming together to create music that relies on each other's culture, each other's language, but at the same time, not just presented by the representative of a particular culture and tradition, but opposite, moved, so that I'm Uzbek, he's Indian, and he's Persian, but now I'm Persian, or he's Persian and he's Indian. It's confusing if I speak this way, but musically, it's a creative process that is exciting and has created new possibilities of music to emerge, artists to connect, interact, and find a way to be able to be valid not only in their part of the world, but globally. And that's what makes me excited about the music world and where it's moving to. Thank you all very much for listening to me and my friends, Mr. Pezhham Akhavass, Mr. Abbos Kosimov, and once again, thank you to Inamuri Foundation for bestowing on me 2022's Kyoto Prize for Art and Philosophy. I hope that I will be able to, in time, emerge to be deserving of this great blessing bestowed on me. Thank you very, very much.